that we should place the idea of a limit on income concentration as one of the top economic policy objectives of governments, along with economic growth, low inflation, low growth of greenhouse gas emissions, and so on. These top objectives of economic policy should include a limit on income concentration at the top, because the costs, economic and social, of the present level, let alone increasing concentration of income at the top, are so high. And the question is why? Why are these costs so high? Well, just to elaborate again on a point that Joe made, the first reason that one could give is that the present degree of income concentration at the top is one of the important drivers, the important causes of financial instability that has now tipped into this great long slump. And there are several mechanisms which link high levels of income concentration to financial instability. One of them is that when income becomes as concentrated at the top as we now see, the economy turns into what you could call, what one commentator has called, the economy becomes a plutonomy, as in plutocracy, but plutonomy, meaning that the economy becomes dominated by moneyed interests. The American historian Arthur Schlesinger Sr. Wrote about America in the 1920s with an ironic twist to Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. He said that in the 1920s, America had become government of the corporation, by the corporation, and for the corporation. A very senior American banker said in 2011 that America has become an example of crony capitalism. Everything depends on who you know and how big your campaign finance contribution is. Writing about the UK, a group of Manchester University academics again expressed the spirit of a plutonomy by saying that the new, this is a quote, the new Treasury doctrine is the impossibility of doing anything that would upset the city, that is the City of London, that is the financial interests of the UK economy. The impossibility that the Treasury must not do anything to upset the city. And so in this plutonomy, governments become very reluctant to regulate finance. They become reluctant to impose progressive taxation. They become reluctant to close down tax havens. And internationally, they become reluctant to impose tough regulation on the biggest global banks. And just yesterday from the Financial Times, we have the headline. The headline reads, quote, "Massive softening of Basel bank rules." These are the rules that require banks to carry more capital and more liquid assets and so on. And then on the inside page, the headline reads, this is again a point that Joe made about the profitability, where banks' profits come from, not lending, but from lobbying. And the headline on the page 4, yesterday's Financial Times reads, "Years of lobbying pay off for banks." Years of lobbying pay off for banks. So this is what happens in a plutonomy. And a plutonomy is generated by high levels of income concentration at the top. And then the second reason why we should put a limit on income concentration at the top as one of the top policy objectives for governments has to do with the social effects of inequality. And here I refer to the book called The Spirit Level, written by Richard Wilkinson and Kate Pickett. And it is a remarkable book. It's based on a study of the social impacts of inequality across the OECD countries and, remarkably, across the 50 US states. So comparing both OECD countries and comparing US states in terms of, on the one hand, their level of income inequality, and on the other, their various measures of social and health problems. For example, problems such as the level of social trust, the frequency of mental illness, including alcohol and drug addictions, frequency of imprisonment, frequency of obesity, levels of children's education performance, frequency of teenage pregnancy, and so on and so on. And what they find is a very strong correlation between levels of inequality, income inequality, and the frequency of those social and health problems. And the even more remarkable finding is that inequality is analogous to pollution, as in air pollution, in the sense that in societies that are more unequal, even the rich people in those more unequal societies have experience higher frequencies of these social and health problems than do rich people in the more equal societies. That's the sense in which inequality is like air pollution, in the sense that even the rich in the more unequal societies cannot escape from these social and health problems. So one thing that economists then should have learned about this current, or coming out of this current long slump, is that inequality carries high levels of both economic and social costs. So far as that I've been able to see, there hasn't been much learning of this kind, but there is nevertheless a growing volume of research evidence which supports that argument. And then the question is, to what extent can our existing plutonomy, can the policymakers in our existing plutonomy actually act on this evidence? That's the big question. Second thing I want to say something about rather quickly is what economists should have learned about financial liberalization and financial globalization. If you take the US and the UK, there have been 4 big experiments in rapid financial liberalization. The first one was in the US in the 1920s. The second one was in the UK in the 1970s, in the early 1970s. The third one was in the US in the 1990s and 2000s. And the fourth one was in the UK in the 1990s and 2000s. The remarkable thing is that we have 4 big cases of rapid financial liberalization, and all of them ended badly. We also have the case, of course, in East Asia through the 1990s, which similarly ended badly, as compared with what happened, for example, in India and China during that time. India and China were relatively immune from what we call the East Asian financial crisis, partly because they did not liberalize their financial system. In particular, they didn't open their financial system in the globalization sense as East Asian countries like Korea and Thailand and so on did. Well, it is remarkable how little has been learned from this experience of 4 big experiments in rapid financial liberalization. However, there is some good news, and as Joe said, we must keep looking for good news, especially at the end. The good news is that there has been some real learning about the hazards of financial globalization, as in opening the capital account, opening an economy to free inflows and outflows of capital. And I refer to the IMF's very recent change of mind. The IMF used to be a very strong advocate of free capital mobility, and it went around the world telling all economies that they had to be moving towards opening their capital account. And one event in the IMF telling everybody they had to open the capital account was in Ethiopia. In Ethiopia in the mid-1990s, when the IMF began to really twist the arm of even the Ethiopian government, of all governments, which was entirely of no interest to international investors. But the IMF nevertheless said to Ethiopia, you have to open your capital account. And it happened that at that very time, the World Bank country economist for Ethiopia was quite opposed to the IMF's views. It also happens that that very same World Bank country economist for Ethiopia in the mid-90s is none other than Akbar Noman, who is sitting at the end of this line. And Akbar persuaded the newly appointed World Bank chief economist, one Joseph Stiglitz, to travel to Addis Ababa incognito, if you can believe that, incognito. I'm not sure whether Joe was wearing a beard and sunglasses, but he tried to be incognito so that he could give some advice to the Ethiopian government as to what they should say to the IMF as it kept twisting their arm to open the capital account. And there's a longer story to tell about that incident, which Joe and Akbar may or may not wish to tell. But in any case, just to come back to the point is that once the crisis began, and once, for example, the IMF went into Iceland, the very first country that the IMF, developed country that the IMF had been into since, with a stabilization program, since Britain in 1976, was Iceland. And the Danish head of the Iceland mission, the IMF mission to Iceland, the Danish head said immediately Iceland must impose capital controls. And he encountered quite a lot of resistance back in Washington at the fund, both from the staff and from the board. But when he explained that Iceland had a huge volume of non-resident asset holders who were holding Icelandic capital, who wanted to get out, and if they tried to get out, they would crash the currency even further. Once he explained this, there was not much more resistance. And so that was an important step on the way to the IMF changing its mind about capital controls. And then there were a series of research papers coming out from the bank which looked at the evidence again and found, lo and behold, that capital controls weren't nearly as disastrous as the fund had been telling people for the previous 30 years. And so in the most recent paper, staff paper that went to the board of the fund, there was a battle inside the fund, inside the staff of the fund, as to whether the paper should say that we, the fund, consider that capital controls can be useful in certain circumstances, comma, but only as a last resort. The battle was whether that qualifying phrase should be added, but only in the last resort. And in the end, the battle was won by people like Olivier Blanchard, the chief economist of the IMF, who did not want that qualifying clause. So the paper says the IMF thinks that capital controls can be useful in certain circumstances, period. And so the Olivier Blanchard faction of the IMF considers this to be a great victory. So the bottom line is this, I think, that if you compare the learning that has taken place since 2008, after this crisis, with the learning that took place after the two big previous crises of Western capitalism, namely the 1930s and then the 1970s, what is remarkable is how little learning has taken place this time compared to the learning that took place after the 1930s and after the 1970s. You can debate whether what economists learned from the 1970s was the correct lesson, because after all they went to hard neoliberalism with Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher. But nevertheless, the point is that there was a change in thinking after the 1970s, as there was a change in thinking after the 1930s. What is remarkable, I find, is that after this major crisis in capitalism now, there has so far been very little change in thinking in the mainstream of the economics profession, with the qualification that I just gave, that the IMF seems to have changed its mind on capital controls. And just to illustrate this point, Ben Bernanke, the chairman of the US Central Bank, said in 2010, he admitted that we got our macroeconomics wrong about not being able to, that is, we were not able to forecast the coming crisis. Then he went on to say, but does this mean we should seriously qualify our existing macroeconomic models? Question mark. To my complete astonishment, he answered his own question by saying, no, we shouldn't qualify our existing models. Why? Because our existing models were models for good times, and they worked for good times, but for bad times, we need a different kind of model. And to me, this is completely amazing that somebody in that position could say that, because what it overlooks is that the causes of the bad times arise in the good times. This was a basic lesson that Hyman Minsky, amongst many others, taught us, or should have taught us. But Ben Bernanke, in that remark in 2010, seemed to be ignoring the basic point that the causes of the bad times begin in the good times, and therefore the models, the macroeconomic models, must include things like the financial sector in a way that, strangely enough, the models that Anne Kruger and Jean-Philippe Cotis, which provided the forecasts that I quoted at the beginning, which were so spectacularly wrong, those models, those macroeconomic models, include no financial sector. That is, they treat finance like oil in the engine, which is necessary for the engine, but it doesn't make the engine go. And so, because their models included no financial sector, they weren't looking at the buildup of debt, unsustainable levels of debt. They were just looking at those things which we call the great moderation, that is low inflation and high employment and so on. They weren't looking at the way that the great moderation was being financed, which was through the buildup of unsustainable levels of debt. So, just to end on a slightly pessimistic note, I think that mainstream economics still has a great deal of learning to do about the macroeconomy, and I don't see much sign of this happening as yet.
Is this right? Oh, is that on? Absolutely brilliant sets of observations. Perhaps, Joe, you might, I mean, we'll have, as I said, a brief discussion amongst the presenters, and then we'll open it to questions. You might want to start with Robert's last comment on macroeconomists have a lot to learn.
Oh, I agree. I got to say, the other macroeconomists have a lot to learn. Actually, there's another quote from Bernanke that actually went on to say that there was really nothing wrong with the models. There was just a few details of the implementation of it. And I think there were a number of fundamental flaws. I mean, let me just amplify what you said, because I think it highlights some of the issues that we're talking about today. One of the things that was missing from the standard macroeconomic models were almost a complete absence of attention to you might call institutions. So there's no detail of any of the institutions, but for instance, the nature of the mortgage market. The mortgage market was at the root at the center of the collapse. But none of what was going on in that mortgage market, incentives, corporate governance, all these issues that we've been talking about, play any role in the macroeconomic model. And when the macroeconomists, when the regulators don't understand that, they're going to make wrong decisions. So an example of this that I've mentioned on a number of occasions, it was that after the crisis, Alan Greenspan, the chairman of the Federal Reserve, was asked to testify what went wrong, and he said that there was a flaw in his reasoning. There's now a whole movie called The Flaw. It happened to be a flaw that cost the world several $1 trillion. Let's put that aside. The flaw was that he thought the bankers would manage the risk better. But any of you who've studied economics would know that if you looked at the incentive structures of the bankers, they had incentives for excessive risk-taking, incentives for short-sighted behavior. The rating agencies had incentives to give A-rated, AAA ratings to F-rated securities. The investment banks had incentives to put together products that were designed to fail so that they could short them against their own customers. And saying, you know, the banks, there used to be a model about bankers were people you could trust, but the president of the head of Goldman Sachs said, anybody who trusts us is foolish. You know, caveat emptor. We are going to create asymmetries of information, and if we can get away with it according to the law, we will exploit them. So this was the new model of capitalism that had been created in the United States, and the regulators didn't understand that, and the models didn't include it. And that's the consequence with some of the crisis. But another example of what went wrong is those models pay no attention to inequality. In fact, the standard model assumed everybody was the same. Now, it's quite remarkable to assume everybody's the same. First of all, you have a problem in my area of work where I worry a lot about asymmetries of information. The only way you can have, the asymmetries of information mean that some people know something that other people don't know, fundamental aspect of market economy. But the only way you can have asymmetries of information in a world where everybody's the same is to have acute schizophrenia. And that's inconsistent with the other hypothesis of rational expectations. So they had some intellectual coherence, cognitive dissonance in a way. But the other aspect is this was a financial crisis. And if you have only one person, who is lending to whom? You're lending to yourself. Well, there's no problem if you only lend to yourself. It's not a complicated financial market. You might wonder why you spend so much money taking money from the left pocket and putting it in the right pocket, but it's not an interesting market. And yet, that was the kind at the center of macroeconomics. But this issue of inequality on the part of the lack of attention on the part to inequality in macroeconomics also gets reflected in central bank policies all over the world. So you have a question, there's a trade-off, say, between inflation and unemployment. Well, who's on the board of most of these central banks? People from the financial community. What do they worry? They don't worry about unemployment. Most of them don't really work anyway. They're just rent seekers. But you have, except in a few countries, no representatives on bank boards, central bank boards, of people who work for a living. So the mindset is of that of those in the financial market. Where inflation, they worry about inflation because if you've lent money and inflation is higher than you expected, the real value of what you get repaid is lower than you would have expected. So I understand that, and there are consequences, but there are also consequences to unemployment. And central banks tend not to pay enough attention to that. But that's just one example of how issues of distribution get shunted out of our models, but then they also get shunted out of key policy decisions.
Yeah. Joe mentioned. Joe mentioned the film, The Flaw, F-L-A-W, and I should perhaps tell you that both of us are in that film. It is a very informative and also entertaining film. I strongly recommend it, especially for...
We don't get any commission. I want to make sure there's no conflict of interest there.
Especially for students. It's about the relationship that we've been talking about here, the relationship between income concentration on the one hand, the financial sector, financial instability, and the crash. That's the chain of connections. Secondly, I want to take the opportunity to tell a quick story about the event that led Joe to see the importance of asymmetrical information, which his work on which was the work that then led to the Nobel Prize. Joe went to Institute of Development Study, Nairobi, after completing the PhD, and in common with other foreigners in Kenya at that time, bought a white Peugeot car, which was known as the foreigner's car. One day he was driving in a rural area, and suddenly a cow ran out from the bushes in front of his foreigner's car, and he hit the cow, and the cow fell down dead. Out of the bushes came a woman who was minding the cow and demanded from him a large amount of reparation for the death of her cow. And so Joe paid out a large amount of money and then went to drive off. And as he did, he looked in the rearview mirror and he saw to his amazement that the cow was back up on its feet and was being led into the bushes, presumably to await the arrival of the next foreigner's car. And so that's when Joe had the idea that asymmetric information and just finally, I wonder whether Joe and Ravi would address a question that I find deeply puzzling, and that is, why is there this austerity drive across Europe and now a re-intensified austerity drive in the United States? Just to put that in context, I want to tell you a quote from a very well-known, highly respected British academic economist who I better not specify any further than that. He told me this in a private conversation just a few months ago. And before I tell you the quote, I should explain. He mentions Robert Skidelsky. Robert Skidelsky is Keynes's biographer and a well-known latter-day Keynesian economist. So my friend, this celebrated British academic economist, said to me a few months ago, Keynes was a disaster. Skidelsky should be locked up. Krugman, that's Paul Krugman, has lost all respect in the economics profession. And the point is that this friend of mine was one of the strong advocates of, or has been one of the strong advocates of the austerity drive, pushing the Bank of England to maintain high interest rates and so on, always worrying about inflation. And I simply don't understand. I mean, this person, for example, is not a moneyed person. He doesn't have a vested interest in the financial sector, yet he strongly believes in the austerity agenda. So the question then to you two, or you three in fact, is why is there this austerity drive? What is promoting it? Who is promoting it?
Well, actually, before answering that, I want to link the question to the issue of inequality, which more closely, and that is I mentioned before that recessions actually are really bad for equality. That when the economy goes into recession, unemployment goes up, and that means those who don't have jobs, obviously their families become poorer. But because there's a high unemployment, wages go down, and that increases inequality, lowers the wage share. And finally, especially in recent years with the austerity, government budgets have to be cut, and the easiest place to cut budgets often are on the social protection areas that affect lower and middle income citizens. So economic downturns are really bad for equality, and the austerity measures, I believe very strongly, have really worsened the prospects for recovery. To me, it is, I agree with you, it's actually remarkable because the historical record, the evidence is so overwhelming against austerity. The first famous episode of austerity was in 1929, where Herbert Hoover succeeded through austerity in converting the stock market crash into the Great Depression. You would have thought that that was a telling story that would discourage people from undertaking it. But then the IMF undertook several involuntary experiments on their patients in Thailand, Korea, Indonesia, Argentina, and the experiments had a 100% track record. Every time austerity was tried, the economy went from a downturn to a recession to a depression. Now, to me, it is, I'm not a European, so I don't understand why so many countries in Europe, having seen this evidence, have one after the other tried austerity. And what's remarkable, as they tried it, it again is almost 100% track record. That is to say, Greece and Spain are now in depression. We should be clear, it's not a recession, it's a depression. 25% unemployment, 50% youth unemployment. Youth unemployment would be higher were it not for the fact that a lot of the youth that can move have left the countries. The UK is in recession, or certainly in a downturn. It's a long term. No, but you know, Europe as a whole is in recession. So it's very hard to understand how people persistently look against the evidence. Now, Arjun here did a study. There was one economist at Harvard, a couple economists at Harvard, who claimed that there was this thing called expansionary contraction. That is to say, you contract government spending and it stimulates the economy. It seemed a little bit magical, and it was sort of like Reagan's view that if you cut taxes, you could raise tax revenue. That idea didn't work. But he claimed to look at a large number of countries. In fact, it turns out if you look at it carefully, the only instance in which governments engaged in contraction, reduced the size of the government spending, and they did well, they grew, was when their trading partners were growing, and so they could substitute exports, especially as they lowered the exchange rate and became more competitive. So if exports come in and fill the hole that is created by reduced government spending, then the economy can grow. But that's not going to happen in Europe. It's not going to happen in the United States. And so the prospects of this working are close to zero. Now, I don't think anybody can understand the mindset of many of the Republicans in the United States. So I'm not going to try to explain how they have so many peculiar views that I don't know where to begin to, I'm not a psychiatrist, so I don't know.
But on going back to inequality, if I may raise, both Joe and Robert essentially took us through a US or US-UK perspective on inequality. Quite right, because Joe's book is focused on that and so on. And I know that they both know what I'm now going to say. But in a developed country context, this notion of inequality, the difference between the top and the bottom, I think has a lot of cutting power, and indeed it's risen greatly, etc. But in a developing country context, where there's substantial heterogeneity of ethnicity, religion, regional variations, etc., there's something alongside the top versus bottom, which may actually be even more, perhaps even more important than that. And that is inequalities between broadly defined groups in society. I was getting at that with the Ghana North-South divide. Okay? It could turn out that measured inequality in Ghana maybe, for example, might fall. But so long as the gap between the North and the South increases, that is a problem for that society. Okay? And I don't need to say anything, I don't need to say any more in the context of India with the regional and caste differences and so on. So that dimension of inequality, I think, is extremely important in the developing country context. And I think we have to be careful not to focus exclusively on the conventional economic approach of the top relative to the bottom, because actually something very important might be happening on this side, on the group side of things. I'll give you an example. In Indonesia, for example, pre-crisis, pre the East Asian crisis, actually all indicators are doing well. All of these big macro level indicators are doing well. Measured inequality was going down. This was going down, that was going down, poverty was going down, etc. But if you look closely, the gaps between the ethnic groups and the gaps between the different islands and so on were not following that trend. And you had to unpack the thing to see, hey, if there's a crisis, something terrible is going to happen. Okay? And when the crisis hit, it wasn't the bottom part of the distribution that was attacking the top part of the distribution. It was one ethnic group was attacking another ethnic group in the distribution.
Yeah, no, I agree very strongly. I just want to add one other element that, again, I discussed in my book, but I think it's universal. And that is, and I hinted at it, which is one of the things that's also very corrosive to the well-functioning society is a sense of unfairness. And so when certain kinds of inequality are acceptable if the people, somebody worked for it, they created something, but when it's viewed as a result of illegitimate processes, illegitimate privatizations, illegitimate use of political power, rank seeking, then you have potential of more political societal problems. And there are many examples of that. In the United States, that was really part of the motivator for the Occupy Wall Street, because people felt it was unfair, it was fundamentally wrong, that this group who had caused the crisis was the only group that did well after the crisis. And they were the only ones that got the big bonuses for creating the crisis. And everybody didn't understand. Incentive pay was supposed to be for good behavior, not bad behavior. And those who are mathematicians might say, well, they made a sign error. But that's not a justification for what was going on. So that was the strong sense of unfairness really motivated. In Tunisia, beginning of the Arab Spring, one of the real concerns was not just youth unemployment, but that those who got jobs were the people who were politically connected to Ben Ali, and it was viewed as a corrupt, illegitimate government. Again, it was a sense of unfairness. In India, I think the issue, and this is true in a lot of other countries, where people are displaced from their land where they're working in order to enable somebody to make large amounts of money by mining, gives rise to a sense of inequity, not only for the people displaced, but broadly for society. And therefore, the issue of how you appropriately deal with the problem, with the treatment of natural resources becomes a really important issue for the sense of social cohesiveness.
Just one little quick comment from me before I do so. Part of the answer to Robert's question on the empire is that the empire strikes back. I mean, why the rise of state? Because economics is a profoundly ideological discipline, and particularly the whole structure that has emerged in the last 20 years. Rational expectations, perfect markets, the focus of central banks on inflation. Keynesianism represents a major threat and a challenge to many of these fundamental presuppositions which are deeply rooted in ideology, which serve certain interests. Anyway, we open it to questions. I think the gentleman who was asking Ravi first, maybe I should begin with him, who on Russia.
Is there a phone, microphone down there?
I don't know how it would be. Is there a mic downstairs? How is it?
We can use this, we can share the mics here. So while they're getting the mic out, let's answer the question about Russia very, very briefly. I think the issue in Russia is that Russia is, inequality in Russia increased very significantly after the fall of the Iron Curtain, the end of communism. So much so that average life expectancy in Russia fell. And now, when you travel in large parts of Europe, let me go back. Some of the people at the time at the IMF and the World Bank would say, look, at Russia's a big success. You go on the streets and you see a lot of Mercedes. And to me, when I looked at all the Mercedes and I saw life expectancy declining, it was a story of a failure. Russia has become, to a very large extent, a natural resource economy. I can't remember the numbers exactly, but it's something like 70% of all the exports are based on natural resources. So it has many of the attributes of a natural resource economy. And I describe countries with the large endowments of natural resource have this problem. They tend a lot of rent-seeking, they grow slower, and they have higher inequality. And so it's showing many of the symptoms of that kind of a natural resource economy.
Yeah, actually, I dropped one case study that I was going to put in a short time. My case study what would be Eastern Europe and Russia. And I actually contrasted with East Asia. Remember, East Asia 60s and 70s story was high growth and falling inequity, rising equality. Normally I contrast that with Eastern Europe and Russia in the 1990s, which was negative growth and rising inequality. So double whammy. And why did that happen is, again, an interesting kind of question, which was written about it. Because there's this notion that you have to jump from here to there very quickly. You have to go from where you were to the market economy overnight. Shock therapy was the term that was used at the time, and as somebody said, it was more shock than therapy. And again, Joe, when you introduce a system or introduce privatization where the institutional framework hasn't been set right, so actually the state's assets were in one fell swoop divided very unequally. So this is actually, again, the opposite of the East Asian case where they started with an equal land distribution for various historical reasons. The Russian economy instituted a very unequal distribution of assets because of the way that they handled the privatization part of it. And all because of this rush to move to a market economy without having the institutions.
Yeah, let me just add one other point. There was a very strong ideology that once you created owners of property, everything would be fine. You would get good institutions. But the obvious point is if you create monopolies, and the monopolies have a lot of power, they're not going to vote for good competition laws. So it didn't work.
So I have a brief question. Yeah, I have the mic.
Okay, so I think what we'll do is that we've had such an interesting discussion. As with such things, it's taken a fair bit of time. So let me just try and manage the questions, because I've seen at least 30 hands already up. And what you're not aware of is that about 200 people are sitting downstairs in the basement. And I have many SMSs with the questions. So if you permit me, I'll handle the questions. Is that all right? Okay, great. So, sir, you had the mic. And we'll go by the mics. I'll handle the mics. So you please come here. I want the people who got the mics here so that I can tell you where to take the mic, and we'll have the question only from those people. Okay? So we'll start with you.
Sir, it is stated that globalization and free market economy have dismantled the welfare state. They have limited the competence of the parliaments. They have affected the sovereignty of the governments. And also, they have also affected the operation of democracy. Is this true? But then how did this situation come about? Because if we see history, we have always seen that the political system controls the economic system. But now, the scenario has completely changed. The economic system is controlling the political system. The political system has lost all its strength. The sovereignty of the state is affected. The parliaments are losing their. I'm talking with reference to what has happened in the European economic crisis, EU economic crisis. How did this happen? That is my first question. And second question is globalization going to be a permanent phenomenon? Will the political system take control and reign in globalization so that it will reassert itself? Thank you.
Okay. Exactly. So we'll take 2 or 3 questions. Can you raise your hands? And it depends on whose hands I see first. Right? So I'm really sorry my line of sight is like this. So, gentleman here. Yeah, you can give them the mic. 1. Take that mic from there. And number 2. Yeah, the person who has got the mic. And that's very unfair. I'll take that mic from you. I'll come back to you. Somebody on that side. The young gentleman there with a tie. Right? And I'm really sorry. If you wish, what we could do is that you could email your questions, and I'll figure out whether somehow I can get some responses. Okay? Those who don't get the opportunity to ask questions. So we'll go there 1, we'll go 2, and we'll go 3. Okay? And we'll add all these 4 questions together, and then you can take them. Is it all right? Okay.
We've seen a significant shift in the way India has grown at a 9%, 9+, and depending on which numbers you believe, to 6 or below 6. Which of them is the exception?
Okay. Thank you. And thanks for keeping the question brief, So please keep your questions brief. Number 2 here. Take the mic back. So I'll come back to you. Number 2 here, and then number 3.
Hi. Thanks very much.
And brief questions, please. Yeah?
I will try to be. My name is Abdul Ghaffar Abdullahi. I'm a Ghanaian by nationality and a PhD student from the University of Manchester in the UK. And my PhD thesis actually borders on the issue of regional inequality and specifically the north-south inequality that Prof. Ravi Kambu talked about. And I've actually been very fortunate to have met him twice at very opportune moments of my PhD research. I first met Ravi during the first 3 weeks of my program, and I met him to add an advice on my thesis. And my question basically is actually in relation to what he thinks is actually the most crucial cause that underpins the north-south inequality in Ghana. And I'm asking this question because you cited the example of the issue of globalization and liberalization and how it gave the South an advantage over the North. And that seems to me to be reducing the problem to issue of geography. And I'm just wondering whether there are some other factors that you think are crucial in understanding this phenomenon.
Thanks. So third question, and then we take all four. Okay?
Yeah.
And then I'll come back to you.
Is democracy a precondition, democracy or human rights, a precondition for reducing inequality? I'll be keeping it brief. Very straight question.
Okay. If you can take the mic back, please. Otherwise, they'll have the tendency to ask a second question. Okay, take the mics back. Okay. So, Akbar, you could sort of take this, all these four.
Start with the globalization. Actually, I want to pose this question to both Joe and to Robert as well as the audience, because certainly listening to some of these things, the words baby and bathwater come to mind. Okay. That, is everything so bad? I mean, we've had these very high growth rates between 9% to 6%. I mean, the notion that 6% growth rate in India is a disaster. It's just incredible that we would now think in these terms. So that's the question that I then pose back to Joe and to Robert. Of course, we should manage the process, and that's one. And if we're not careful about particularizing inequality, we could actually destroy the process of growth that is ongoing. But what was it that led to this process of growth in the first place? Surely openness to the external economy. Surely openness to the outside world has to be one of the reasons why this was the case. And again, it's not a mindless opening up a la the IMF that Robert Wade mentioned and so on. But the notion that somehow we could have done this through autarky also doesn't sit right. Okay? So that's really, that's my response in a sense to what you were saying, which is in some sense I don't see an alternative to engaging with the world economy. It's a question of how does one do it and on what terms. And so that's the thing that I pose to Joe.
Let me, I agree very strongly that the issue is how you manage globalization, how you manage openness. So, for instance, one of the issues that Robert and I have both emphasized is the link between instability and inequality. And it's a two-way relationship. Inequality leads to instability, but also instability leads to inequality. I talked about how recessions are bad, that it's always the people at the bottom who suffer the most. So there's this two-way leakage. The wrong kind of opening, for instance, opening markets to short-term unstable capital flows, which is what is usually meant by capital market liberalization. Opening up to financial markets from the US to sell CDSs, derivatives, these risky products, which even people like Paul Volcker, chairman of the Federal Reserve, said has never produced any growth in the United States. It just produced instability. That's the kind of thing that's a mistake. And I think that's where a lot of the debate in India ought to be, is how do you manage that opening to keep out the things that are a problem, but get in the things that are going to be beneficial. And these are big macro issues in finance. One of the big issues that's being debated in India now is how will opening retail stores to foreign direct investment affect the distribution of income. And I think it's a good thing that there has been a lot of attention to the issue of distribution effects, Some people saying that it will increase the price, the income that farmers receive because it will make the supply chain more efficient. And another view is that it will allow facilitate bringing in cheap Chinese imports based on monopsony power of one of the big international retailers that has developed an expertise in some other kinds of activities like bad labor rights, bribery, importing certain skills that you may already have. But the attention, I think, is a good one on who is going to be hurt and helped by this kind of change. It won't make a big difference for your overall growth rate. There, the distribution effect is going to be actually the centerpiece of the effects of what is going on. But if there are these adverse supply chain effects, then it actually can have some effects on economic growth. I wanted to just, in terms of the question, I thought, which is, quote, the normal, should it be 6 or 9? There are a couple of aspects of that I want to just mention very briefly. First, I chaired a commission, International Commission on the Measurement of Economic Performance and Social Progress, and one of the things that we emphasized is that GDP is not a good measure of economic success. So in my mind, it's not just, you shouldn't be just focusing on the number 6 or 9, and that can distract attention from more fundamental issues like who is benefiting, is the growth sustainable? And that brings to the second question, was the 9% sustainable? Well, some aspects of the 9% were not sustainable. Agriculture, which is not doing particularly well, was actually depleting groundwater. And even that low rate of growth is not sustainable. And that's a real problem that needs to be addressed. On the other hand, and I think there are, some of the growth without adequate investments in infrastructure, without dealing with the problems of the natural resources in a good way, I think all of those are not going to be sustainable. So in that sense, the 9% was not based on a set of policies that could go on like that forever. On the other hand, if you look at the gap between per capita income in India and that in, say, the advanced countries, there's an enormous opportunity to close that gap. And there's no economic theory that says that there's a limit on the rate at which that gap should be closed. So in my mind, if there's, good savings rate, higher, it's been declining in India, but you've got the savings rate high, you invest in education and technology, you close that knowledge gap, I think you could sustain a rate of growth of 9%. And I think India is a large enough economy that it could do that even given volatility in the international market, which is not the same as saying closing yourself off from the international market. But you have to be aware that that international market is very volatile, and you have to be able to cope with that volatility.
Yeah, let me take up Ravi's point that we're being too pessimistic. And Joe implicitly just endorsed that line that we have been too pessimistic. I want to bring a little pessimism back. And my point is that development is a really difficult process. There's nothing inherent in market systems which produces development, so to speak, automatically. In other words, Adam Smith was wrong when he wrote those famous 40 words. You remember he said, little else is required to attain the highest state of opulence from the lowest depths of barbarism than peace, easy taxes, comma, and a tolerable administration of justice, all the rest follows in the natural course of things. Greg Mankiw, professor of economics at Harvard, said a while ago in the Wall Street Journal, Adam Smith was right when he said that. Well, I think that the evidence shows clearly Adam Smith was wrong, as in, if you ask the question, how many countries, how many non-Western, that's the important point, how many non-Western countries have become developed countries in the past 200 years, not since the Second World War, since the Industrial Revolution 200 years ago, how many? However generously you stretch non-Western and you stretch the notion of development, you cannot get more than 10 countries, and probably you're only going to get about 6 or 7, namely Japan, Russia, South Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore. You see, we're stretching the terms already. If we call Hong Kong and Singapore non-Western, and maybe Israel, if you call Israel non-Western. But it's difficult to get more than about that number. And that just underlines the point. Development is a really difficult business. It's not something that happens sort of by itself, by having just a good infrastructure and a good education system, and all the rest will occur in the natural course of things. Adam Smith was wrong.
So, Akbar will take the next set. Shall we take the next set?
Well, let me answer. There was one question, if I understood it correctly, about democracy and the relationship between equality. And I think there's no, it used to be thought that you had to have democracies for high growth, or that you couldn't have democracies. People argued both ways. I remember textbooks in 1950s saying, oh, the reason Russia is growing so rapidly is because it's not democratic. And then when it slowed down, they say the reason Russia is growing slowly is because it's not democratic. So I think the experience is that there's just no clear relationship either between growth, democracy ought to mean more than just going to the polls every 2 years. If you have a system where you use the legal system to deny the right to vote to large segments of your population, but you do it democratically, you pass laws, is that a democracy? And it certainly doesn't get kudos to me in a good democracy. And many of the states in the United States, the Republicans are trying to make it difficult for poor people or African Americans or Hispanics to vote. And it's a concerted campaign to, and we've had lots of these campaigns of what are called disenfranchisement. So this is not the first time, and so that's one example. Gerrymandering. Most of you know that the Republicans have a majority of votes, a majority of seats in the House of Representatives, one of the two houses in our parliament. But the Democrats got more than 1 million more votes in Congress for the congressmen. But gerrymandering means that even though most people voted for a Democratic congressman, most congressmen are Republican. So all these are flaws in our democratic system. They're not complete flaws because originally there are arguments that you want regional representation, you want protection of minority interests. But they are, the way they've been, where the way they've evolved have undermined the true sense of democracy, I would argue, in the United States. And even more so, revolving doors, campaign contributions, and effective money. So the answer is when you have that kind of flawed democracy that the United States has, you have this process that I described where politics leads to more inequality.
All right. I have actually a question for all of you, which is this, that, we have overrun our scheduled time, but our panelists have kindly agreed to go on for another 10, 15 minutes. So would you wish to go on or would you wish to end now? We'll go on? Okay. Now, if you're going to do that, I'll continue to do this in my own way. And we'll take 3 questions from here. And I've got about 10 questions from downstairs. And of those 10 questions, I think 3 of them have been already anticipated by you. That's about political representation and stuff like that. So, sir, your question first. The gentleman right at the back. Can you give the mic there? Right at the back. Gentleman right at the back. And at the back there, the white shirt. Okay? So please go ahead. And please keep your questions brief.
My question is not related to structural economics. It's rather more topical. In recent weeks, we have been exposed to this new jargon called fiscal cliff in the US. And we came across a decision recently that the Senate had passed, which said that the income tax rate will be increased from 34% to 39% for those who are earning above $450,000. Now, in the context of reducing inequality in the US, this appears to be fairly a very cosmetic decision. What would you have done if you were in the government?
Thank you. Yeah, back at the back.
This is a question for Professor Stiglitz. You laid blame on the Republicans for the present financial conditions in the US. What do you think about the repeal of Glass-Steagall? And given that it was done by a Democratic president, would you think that he is responsible for a big part of the mess?
Great. That's a brief question. Wonderful.
Okay.
The third question from there, the gentleman in the white shirt right at the back.
Thank you. I just wanted to ask if times of change lead to rising inequality. For instance, you said that inequality rose at the end of the 19th century or the early 20th century, so to say. And then again, that all this happened recently. And even before that, perhaps inequality has risen. So my question really is that, when railways came in, there was a lot of change that happened. When electricity and all the related inventions happened, there was a lot of change that happened in society. And now with computers and technology, a lot of change is happening. Do you really think that change is really a driver of this inequality too, in addition to all the other factors that you have mentioned?
We can go.
So let me try to answer questions, at least from, fairly briefly. I agree with you that the change from 35% to 39.6% was, I would say it's more than cosmetic, but it really doesn't appropriately deal with the problems. I would have had more progressivity to the tax rate. I would have raised it higher. There's some economic research that's looked very carefully about labor supply elasticities, what would be the adverse effect, and they suggest that we could have substantially higher tax rates without any significant adverse effects. Secondly, one of the reasons that people like Romney are able to pay such low taxes is that we tax speculators, capital gains, at a much lower rate than we do ordinary income. We tax dividends at a lower rate than we do. So I would have introduced what we call a fair tax system, where everybody, they would be taxed at least the same rate. Now, you might want to, if you wanted to complicate the tax system a little bit, give a little bit lower rate to those who are really entrepreneurs and a higher rate to speculation, whether it's land speculation or financial speculation. There's also, we need to do more with our estate tax. We have a whole set of provisions on corporate welfare, we call it, where corporations get all kinds of benefits. GE, one of the largest corporations, I think has not paid any taxes for years because it's taken advantage of all the loopholes. So there's a whole range of ways of closing loopholes, and much of this has to do with globalization and tax avoidance, and I would close down the Cayman Islands. As you know, as a beach, it's fine, but as a banking center, I haven't figured out why it's there. So those are among the things that I would have done. Yes, Glass-Steagall was passed when was repealed by a Republican-dominated Congress when Clinton was the president. The story of that is talked about in my book, The Roaring '90s. While I was chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors, there was a lot of push from Wall Street to get it repealed, from people like Larry Summers and Bob Rubin. And I strongly opposed it, and I can say that it wasn't because of me perhaps, but it didn't happen while I was as chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors. It's basically, one of the really interesting things is it was called the Citibank Act because it allowed Citibank to be formed buying travelers insurance. And the interesting thing is that Sandy Weil wrote an op-ed in the New York Times saying he was the chairman that brought it together, made a fortune in doing it, said it was probably a mistake. So it's an interesting piece of history. I won't comment on the large number of U.S. Treasury officials and IMF officials who rotated after doing good service to Citibank. Let me stop there. There was a last question.
So the question was on time to change, right?
Oh, yes. Yeah.
So I think that's a very good point, and it relates to the point that I was making again about structural inequality. If you start off with a situation in which there's inequality, and then you create opportunities, let's say opening up the economy, then obviously some of those people will be better placed to take those opportunities than others. Better education, closer location to the coast in the Chinese case, or whatever. Okay? So if you start with structural inequalities and you create opportunities, there's bound to be a process whereby those opportunities are taken by some, not others. And I think that's what we've seen. Now, the answer to that is not, therefore, to not create those opportunities, but to address those structural inequalities and to use the resources generated by the increased opportunity to actually redistribute. So I think conceptually that's how I like to think of it. So I would reject the notion that you shouldn't therefore open up the economy, etc., because it's leading to this rising inequality. It's a question of how one manages that process.
Can I just?
But the central point is right that times have changed, can indeed lead to rising inequality.
Can I just give a little further elaboration? One of the arguments that many people in Scandinavia argue for why they have a good social protection system is that it actually makes a broader support for changes, because they're aware that those changes are going to have these distributional consequences. But they say, look, we're going to have strong active labor market policies, job retraining programs, so that everybody in the society, or at least most people, will benefit as a result of the change. As opposed to what's going on in some other countries where, in response to globalization, they say, oh, we have to cut away government programs, cut away social safety net. And then you ask the question, what's going on here? Globalization was supposed to make everybody better off, but in fact, as the people who, large fractions are getting worse off, they're being told, you still have to get worse off in order to you to get more of this thing that's making you worse off.
Just on that same point, the danger with the line of argument that you made, I think, is that it readily supports the conclusion that, well, inequality goes up at times of change, and so it's just inevitable, and that's that. And that kind of fits with the standard economists, mainstream economists' line that the rich should be encouraged to get richer, and then eventually everybody will get better off because the rich are richer. And that's exactly the kind of complacency, the kind of nonchalance, as in Willem Buiter's remark, poverty bothers me, inequality does not, I just don't care. That's the kind of nonchalance that I think a lot of the research that lies behind the arguments we've been making really does undermine. The question then is, to what extent will this research, these arguments that we've been making, feed into mainstream thinking about inequality and the responsibility of governments to try and act in terms of taxes, spending, and regulation. These are the three main thrusts to prevent times of change from generating sustained and increasing income inequality.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, what we'll do is, in the interest of fairness, we'll take one question from downstairs, and we'll end with that. That'll be the last question. And it's a broad kind of a question addressed to Joe, which may interest most of us here, which is that, if it is not GDP-driven targeted economics, which is the GDP growth, it's more about well-being. And you have written about that. Could you sort of elaborate on that? What are we really targeting? What are the kind of economic goals that we must have as countries?
Well, the Commission on the Measurement of Economic Performance and Social Progress highlighted a number of deficiencies in our standard measure and outlined sort of an agenda for trying to create a better set of measures. One of the point, and I'll comment on those criticisms in a moment, but one of the important points that we emphasized was that you can't summarize anything as important and complex as the entire economy of society in a single number, that it was a mistake to do that. If you're driving a car and you want to know how well you're doing, you might want to know your speed and how much gas you have in the gas tank. If you're going, say, at 50 miles an hour and you have 200 miles you can go in your car, if you add those two numbers together, you might get a single number, but you wouldn't know how to interpret it. It would have no value. So you want a relatively small set of numbers that captures a lot of what is going on, critical things, but you can't do it in a single number. So what are the things that we identified that are important? Well, one of the things that gets left out in GDP, or GDP per capita, is a measurement of inequality, of distribution. I described before how in the United States per capita income has been going up, but most individuals are getting worse off. And that's not a good measure of performance. A society in which most individuals year after year are worse off is not a well-performing economy. And you shouldn't let yourself to get deluded. So what we say is one of the things you ought to look at is a number, perhaps, median income of what's happening to the representative individual. Second thing, you want to know about sustainability. And that was a little bit of the question about the 6 or 9%. If you're growing on the basis of depleting your natural resources, depleting your water supply, and you know your agriculture sector is going to be dead or is going to have real problems, you're not going to be able to have water for your people. It's not sustainable. It's not environmentally sustainable. From the global perspective, we know that with global warming, we are not, the world as a whole is not environmentally sustainable. But for an individual country, these issues of environmental degradation, resource depletion are critical. But there's a broader sense also of economic sustainability. Before the crisis, many people thought the United States was doing well. Just like before Argentina's crash, a lot of people thought Argentina was doing well. But anybody who looked more closely realized that in the case of the United States, our growth was based on debt, on a bubble that was artificial. And the same thing for Argentina. We just imitated Argentina without realizing it. And so, again, you want to know something about debt economic sustainability. A final aspect that I want to mention now is there are many aspects of individual and societal well-being that aren't captured in the conventional way that economists talk about things. So let me just give you a couple examples, and they are beginning to be reflected in a couple countries in policy. And one of the exciting things is to see how these ideas are becoming more widespread. So one of the things that in the traditional economics model, unemployment is only important because of the lost output. So if somebody was unemployed and you gave him adequate unemployment insurance, he wouldn't care. The evidence is that that's not true. People don't like to be idle. And they don't like to, you know, most people want to contribute to society. And if they're just sitting there doing nothing, they don't have a job, it's very bad for their mental health, for their family, for their divorce rates, for suicide. It shows up in lots of other social indicators that go beyond the income. So there's a wealth of data that says that employment is important, and we don't include it. But we ought to. So it ought to be an explicit target of economic policy to promote employment. As another example, Bob Putnam, who's written this a series of books, most famous was Bowling Alone, he's a political scientist, sociologist, where he says that one important aspect of societal well-being is connectedness. People being connected with other people in a variety of ways. And one of the things that's concerned with is, as with globalization, with marketization, some of the connections get broken, and more people become isolated. And as they become isolated, their sense of well-being deteriorates. And that's an example of an idea that actually had some influence in some discussions. I don't know what the outcome was, some discussions in the UK. Because they were discussing about shutting down village post offices. And from an economic point of view, the post office was not making much money. It was a cost center, not a revenue center. But then they came to understand that the village center, the village post office, was a place where everybody in the village met. They got together, it was a place that they connected with each other, and they became worried that if they shut down the post office, the life in the village would be diminished, and people would become more isolated from each other. There wouldn't be any place where they would get together. So they might eventually shut down the post office, but at least they're beginning to focus on how do we create communities in which people can interact, and as our society changes, as we get more urbanization. So there's no simple answer to your question. Finally, one of the things that we argued on the commission was that discussions about what societal objectives ought to be, what are the things that people ought to be concerned about, how do we measure it, ought to be part of public dialogue. It ought to be one of the points where people ought to be getting together, government officials. So the planning shouldn't be just about how much one sector should grow or how another sector should grow, but how do we what do we mean by an increase in the well-being of our society, and how do we get there?
Thank you, Joe. You know, we've repeatedly talked about hope and pessimism, right? And Joe tried to end on a note of hope, and Robert took it back to pessimism. Yeah. You know, I want to end on a note of hope. Those of you who live in Bangalore, you're familiar that we are, from a traffic standpoint, we are in the heart of darkness, right? This particular place. Because getting here is impossible, and going out is what you'll experience now. Now, the reason for hope is that, you know, I had never imagined that if 4 economists would be talking, and with their leanings, we'll have a house full of this nature with the aisles packed and with 200 people down. So thank you so much for coming. And that's reason for hope, because you're interested. And my friend Akbar, who so graciously agreed to be the master of ceremonies, thank you so much. And of course, to Robert, Ravi, and Joe. I think a big hand. We had a wonderful conversation. Thank you so much. And I also promise you that in case you write to me with your questions, I'll get you the answers from them. All right? Thank you.